This is about kind of making sense of intersectionality. So we'll go through a course of understanding and kind of understand the definition of it, ways you can use it, for example, in your programs or curriculum, and also in terms of action plans, for example. And so hopefully the idea is that, you know, within this next hour, we'll cover some ground so you can draw some inspiration, spark some new ideas about thinking about action development and your interventions as well. So very briefly, we'll go over a bit of a definition of what intersectionality is, where it comes from. I'll also present some tools and visuals that you can use to help inform some of your work as well. We'll talk a little bit about systems thinking very briefly as well. So how are we trying to generate action plans or actions and interventions in the system of a school or a university more broadly? So think about how do we contextualize interventions and actions in this space, how we can use journeys and mapping. So we talk a lot about pipeline data, for example, and those are particularly pertinent for charter marks. Data is really, really critical. So how do we go beyond the pipeline to kind of understand the qualities of that pipeline, the qualities of the experience that wraps around it as well? And then how do we act on intersectionality as well? So we'll have a bit of time as well to think about how do you put this kind of blue sky metaphor theory into practice, into action as well. So very briefly, I just want to kind of get a baseline. This is by no means a test of anyone's ability. You won't be thrown out if you get it wrong or anything like that. But I really just wanted to ask the question of, if I say intersectionality, what comes to mind for you? What do you say? And this is really just to get a sense check of, what do we think intersectionality is? You know, and like I said, there's no pass mark for this. So if you'd like to have a go either on your computer using the web link and the code, or if you've got a smartphone, you can scan the QR code and it should come up with a poll, and you can type your responses and reflections there. So I'll just give a minute or two on this particular space. And just to note, this is a safe and compassionate space. There's there's always simple answers are absolutely fine as well, and all that kind of stuff. So, confluence, that's a new one. I've not seen that when I've done these interactions before. So, positive, justice, fairness, everyone, aspects, many aspects, communities, inclusion. Great. This is great, and part of doing this is really thinking about how is often we think we don't know much about term intersectionality, but actually that there's a lot we can bring to making sense of it. See, inclusion seems to be the heavyweight word of fairness, which is quite interesting. I know a few more people are still typing, so I'll just give another minute there. I think one of the things that I was saying already is some of the kind of characteristics of intersectionality, some of the values that it brings. And it's interesting to see some diversity and inclusion as part of that. And I think that's absolutely critical. So intersectionality is absolutely critical to diversity and inclusion work. It's what helps us tackle some more complex issues in this space as well. Great, thanks for sharing that. And hopefully what this kind of cloud indicates is that intersectionality represents all of these different facets. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into some of the 3 core areas of what intersectionality is as well. So very briefly, just in terms of its history, is a metaphor serviced by Black feminist scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s, 1990s. It's safe to say that intersectionality is not something that started in the 80s. We've been intersectional for a long time, but what I think is really important to recognize here is that this metaphor and the way we understand it and use it today was coined and pioneered by Black feminist scholars like Crenshaw and Angela Davis, for example. And initially it came from the scholarship and experience of Black women who experienced domestic violence in the States. And that was the premise of that paper in the late 1980s, looking at the ways in which Black women experienced a domestic violence system when they were seeking support in that. And then they started to understand the ways in which disadvantage and inequality overlaps one another. And there's a simultaneity of inequality, that there's no such thing as just experiencing sexism or racism, but actually more often not, they're the people experiencing both sexism and racism at the same time. And we've seen this kind of modernized discourse and language come into play. For example, the label misogynoir is something that we see, which really represents that intersectional issue. Now, the premise and core of it comes from kind of racial theory. However, it does extend beyond gender and race. It encourages us to go further, to look and address some of the complex challenges, perhaps around gender and sex, trans inclusion, for example. Some of those more contentious, difficult issues that we're trying to create positive actions on as well where possible. But I think one of the core things is that intersectionality helped us produce a language around the multiple disadvantages, multiple vulnerabilities, that no inequality is siloed. And I think that's just really critical to the heart of it as well. So in the initial kind of paper, or kind of what Kimberly Crenshaw was talking about, she divided intersectionality into three broad areas. The first was around structural, so the ways in which marginalized groups were experiencing a particular system or that is meant to enable liberation. So for example, if we look at a very kind of prominent data set of the role of the number of Black female professors in the UK higher education system, we know there is an issue with that system, which is meant to be enabling and empowering people, is oppressing and marginalizing Black females reaching or trying to get to that professorship level in some ways. And I'm reducing that issue down, but it's just to kind of get an idea of the structural nature of it. Intersectionality is also understood in terms of its political kind of component. What are the policies, social policies, politics that influence the marginalization of different groups as well. And we've seen a lot of the ways in which wider policy movements have an impact on people in the workplace and in organizations as well, and also wider social movements that we've seen over the last few years. And then representational as well. So it's looking at the ways in which marginalized groups are represented. Most commonly, and I think one of the key examples of this is looking across the third sector, so particularly development charities that have used imagery of Black minority ethnic communities in the global South to further their agenda, or to portray a particular image about those particular countries and their cultures as well, which is often seen as exacerbating sort of the deficit model, but also just kind of not telling the whole story of a particular country as well. So those are some examples of where we see these three areas. So as we're kind of going back to that word cloud, we talk about fairness, different components, different aspects. This is how the intersectionality metaphor is kind of divided into these three areas. So you're looking at all these different values of intersectionality around inclusion, diversity in these particular kind of components as well. And it goes a little bit further than that too when we come to intersectionality will. So intersectionality does come from the kind of anti-racist literature and school of thought. As I mentioned, it is premised and developed, kind of coined by Black female scholar activists. And it's kind of notioned on the fact that you center race as your and racism as your kind of unit of analysis, your unit of action as well. And you look at the ways in which race intersects with different identities and groups as well. And that's kind of where the premise of it's come from. Obviously, nowadays we see intersectionality being used much more broadly, looking at multiple different characteristics and identities to address inequalities as well. And I think that's the key thing, is the ways in which it's the way in which intersectionality helps us bridge between our histories, so where we come from, our identities, our composition, the structures we experience and the systems we kind of move through and traverse through as well. And I think that's one of the key parts about this is, in some ways. So when you're thinking about your kind of action plans or your gender, your European action plans, for example, you're looking not just at the way in which gender and race kind of intersect, but you're looking at the way in which race intersects with gender. And it's a slightly different lens when you're kind of approaching gender data with a race lens. You have a slightly different kind of understanding of the data in some ways. So there's something quite interesting when you see that happen as well. So there are some issues that have been highlighted by, with intersectionality, particularly over the last few years, often seen as intersectionality creates a competition of inequalities. That is often, you have to choose one over the other rather than kind of look at them collectively. People see intersectionality as quite mystical, this kind of mystic, magical thing in some ways. And there's some skepticism around it. What do we actually do with this kind of metaphor? How do we actually put it into practice? See a lot of intersectionality focused on identities and characteristics rather than structures or overlapping inequalities, which can sometimes create sort of a diversity and inclusion paralysis when we've got so much trying to meet the needs of everyone, but we can't seem to do that. And also, how do we even implement it? And we'll talk about some approaches to that as well. I think it's worth saying that the role of intersectionality was never to create a hierarchy or exacerbate a hierarchy of inequality. It was always premised on the notion that you work with your most marginalized and oppressed group in your community, the ones that are often most silenced, not participating, and you work with them to create something that's inclusive with their voices, with their experiences, and with them. So it's not anything you create is not exclusive to that group, but it's inclusive of them. So I think that's a really key part of kind of thinking about intersectionality as well. So how do we make sense of it? We've talked very briefly about these kind of structural, political, and representational parts. We've talked a little bit about your kind of interpretations of it as well in some ways through that word cloud. How do we start to slowly bring this down to earth in some ways? So this is kind of a simple visual of what intersectionality does and where it sits. So as I mentioned before, it sits between the social side of inequality and diversity and inclusion, helps us understand the ways in which protected characteristics and further identities shape one another. Also, how do these kind of these analyses inform our practice? What do we develop as a result of this? What programs or actions can we develop as a result of what we know about the landscape? And also, how are we informing and being informed by the political side of things as well? So intersectionality sits at the center of all of these quite big areas. Now, the next slide I'm going to show, I think, is the intersectionality role, which kind of blows this up even more. So don't be too alarmed by it. There's a lot to look at. But essentially, this particular intersectionality was developed from a group of Canadian feminist researchers, tried to kind of visualize where, what does intersectionality look like? How do you put a visual against it? So essentially, if you put your particular group or community or kind of program or challenge at the center of this wheel, you have to think about the ways in which the indirect and direct impact your program or intervention or action plan might have on these particular different identities. You then have to think a little bit about the degree further than that, is what isms or inequalities does it exacerbate or is it informed by, and which ones are you addressing, and what's being missed out. And then it's also being cognizant that when you're creating an action plan or thinking about the implementation of actions, how is it informed or being respondent to the wider forces? So of globalization, of social forces, historical forces, for example, and things like that. So it's kind of going, rather than just creating an action for the sake of addressing a pipeline issue, we're going further and beyond to get to the root of the problem where possible, to tackle the most difficult issue, to really kind of enhance that diversity and inclusion work. Now, it's not to say that the action plan needs to address all of these things on this slide, but it's getting us to a place where we feel comfortable to have conversations and to challenge ourselves about, are we actually, when we're developing or rethinking our curriculum to be more inclusive, have we really thought about the ways in which sexism or ageism play a role in this? Can we think about ways to mitigate that? How are we including people's histories into the classroom, for example? And also from a staff perspective as well. If we look at promotions processes as one thing, are the promotions process conducive to or kind of inclusive of these range of identities? Are the informal promotions processes exacerbating some of the inequalities? And where is this kind of informed by as well? So these are the kinds of questions we can start to ask by putting different programs and challenges here at the center of this. So any action plan and kind of notion around intersectionality recognizes that we have to look at the ways in which identities are shaped by systems or by the organizational context in some ways. So university systems are complicated, they're messy, often departments and schools or faculties, whichever, or colleges even, they don't often communicate with one another. And sometimes you find that there's a lot of duplicating things and great things that are happening across. We often see this across university systems, so it is complicated. Universities have transformed quite considerably over the last 100 years. The functions have become more modernized, more commercial. It's also seeing job titles changing as well. The introduction of more kind of private sector roles coming into the university space to increase market presence and attract more students and staff as well. So we know that universities are very complicated, and they're not just, I mean, there's a lot of compounding on universities as well. So this is a kind of a quote from an article which kind of just recognizes where universities come from. And I think before, when we're trying to generate sort of diversity and inclusion action and think about kind of our D&I approaches and think about intersectionality, one of the things I mentioned is about understanding the histories of systems and the history of where things have come from. So we know that universities, for example, typically have a link to kind of colonialism in some way. I'm not a historian by any means, but I know there's evidence to show that in some ways. So we have to kind of acknowledge that. We have to think about, if we're trying to disrupt the system to make it more inclusive, what are we working with? So it's kind of getting a better understanding of this as well. And this is where we see a lot of conversations about decolonizing and decentering different kinds of knowledge and action as well in some way, shape, or form. So this particular quote, I'll just take the first half of it because I think it's really interesting. And this is from 2020, where the individual says, it's not in the university's interests, and nationally people don't want to see this kind of discussion take place because it requires us to revisit the UK's relationship with empire and have an honest conversation about race construction and racism, which is very different from what we are told and taught. So when we're looking at that kind of intersectionality wheel, this is an example of those kind of wider historical forces that can shape the way in which we make sense of people's experience of particular staff or student experience as one example. And this is really important to think about the action plans going from kind of superficial action plans to real kind of sustainable kind of embedding action plans that really kind of facilitate change as well. So thinking about that context to affect the biggest change. So let's take a very kind of example of a university system. So I recently had an EdTech collection come out this year titled Anti-Racism in Higher Education. And one of the things that we did as part of that book was looking at the ways in which universities are kind of set up in some way, shape or form. And these were the sort of the kind of the general areas of a university function across the board. And obviously there will be some tweaks within these different areas as well. And what was quite interesting is looking at these different spaces was the ways in which, and students should be here as well, but they seem to have gone off, gone off there as well in some ways, is that university systems are quite complicated in some ways. And they often look a bit like this. So there's lots of overlapping relationships, lots of kind of different things happening at different times, different strategies, different agendas, different priorities as well. And I think this is a really interesting part. And then you look at the university system, which is compounded by different frameworks and governing bodies. So you've got kind of the knowledge excellence framework, research excellence framework, teaching excellence framework. There's the APP plans. There's lots in terms of like quality assurance as well and things like that to think about. So there's a lot of compounds on the university system. And in particular, and my background, my doctorate was in medical education, so also recognize the role which health governing bodies also compound onto schools as well in this particular area. So just very briefly, the role of the system is to understand the core organizational functions, and you can do this at a school level, and understanding the relationships and assumptions between different components or functions of the school within the university. It's recognizing the key agents or change makers, so thinking about accountability lines already, and also helps think about the things you can do that lead to your outcomes as well. So if you've got your diversity and inclusion strategy, these systems are a way of kind of mapping that out and thinking about this in some way. Intersectionality is really key to that because you're looking at trying to address the deep-rooted issues and challenges to achieve those outcomes in a more sustainable way as well. So using that intersectionality will be really interesting when you're looking at your action plan. So this is just a secondary poll, and I just wanted to kind of get thinking about your kind of school system or even your wider university system. Where do you think, or what kind of role do you think intersectionality should play in that system? So I'll give you give you a moment. Hopefully, you can get to the QR code on there. So remove barriers and aspects of everything in the system, education, okay, representation, if you're having any issues with the the poll or the QR code, feel free to drop some messages in the chat as well if you feel comfortable. Communication, conversation. That's great. So moving on to sort of like the behaviors of intersectionality in some ways. So looking at actually intersectionality as a tool to have those conversations, to think about safety in an environment, because you're having to address a wider range of inequalities and overlapping disadvantages. Recognizing you can't look at identities or protected characteristics without understanding a little bit about the context in which you're working within. And also helps us, intersectionality is that tool, that metaphor which we can use to lever barriers, so we can use data in a different way to have a different conversation, a more sophisticated conversation about diversity and inclusion, and also a sophisticated conversation about inequality as well. So it helps us get that step further in some ways. And yeah, the barriers part is really, really important. I think identifying those barriers is important. Intersectionality is utilizing intersectionality, that wheel, for example, some of the other diagrams, or even that's understanding from the structural, representational, political part can help address some of those barriers as well. You talk about that in terms of who's your senior leader buy-in, who are the people supporting and sponsoring this work as well. So in terms of kind of slowly getting closer to the earth now, kind of moving towards the principles of action in some ways. So these are kind of core values or kind of value statements around what intersectionality should look like in action. So we're shifting away from aggregating and disaggregating data by characteristics, but we're looking at inequalities. So we're looking at the range of inequalities that exist within the system and tackling those and addressing those to create a more inclusive and diverse context, university, higher education system, focusing on voice and experience. So it's all good having that staff and student pipeline data, and that's really, really important. However, what can we say about the qualities of those data points? What are the experiences where possible that wrap around that? How can we use stories to change hearts and minds? That this isn't an interpersonal issue, it's a systemic issue that we're dealing with. Leading towards inclusion, so that's thinking a little bit more on the culture side of things, being led by evidence, and that speaks to the evidence and data. And one of the key other parts of intersectionality is this notion of collaboration. Some institutions are calling it allyship, some say collective action. But I put collaboration here because I think that's really, really important. When we're working with underrepresented groups, we need to think about the ways in which the majority and the majoritized groups are there supporting and actively supporting, and then moving this work along as well. So if we're in a meeting where there is no representation, who is going to be in that meeting to call things out and call things in and create that learning that can happen in that space as well? And how do we be participatory? More often than not, we see a lot of kind of actions or interventions or programs developed in consultation with the community. But how many of these actions can we say involve the community or the staff and students in some way, shape or form? How can we challenge ourselves and say, actually, for developing a program or an intervention or an action, can we honestly say that we've actually involved the key group in the entirety of its life cycle? And that notion of participation, I think, is really, really interesting and important, particularly if we want to be designing things that are inclusive. And if you're thinking about the notion of design and designing actions in particular, and this is probably going against a little bit of the smart framework you're probably working towards in your Athena Swan applications, but I think it's helpful just to kind of have an alternative viewpoint to consider the way in which actions can be designed as well. And this isn't to kind of replace the smart framework in any way, shape or form, but it's just kind of an alternative view to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that in some places. So in terms of thinking about our development of actions or interventions, is thinking about this double diamond approach of discovery, thinking about where the evidence is coming from, who's involved in this, does it involve the voice and experiences in different structures, how are we defining the action or the intervention, and is it meeting the requirements of the most marginalized group? It goes back to that intersectionality principle. Who is the most marginalized community in your context? Who are the ones that you do not hear from or often not involved in participating? How do we define this with them? Then you can start developing your actions. You can start the development of an intervention. You can develop it with the community as well. And you can then think about your delivery of that too. So again, this isn't thinking about creating actions for one group only or creating a service for one group only, but creating actions that are inclusive of the group that are never heard, and never involved and not often seen in some ways. And this is getting us to think a little bit more closely about bringing those principles of intersectionality into the ways in which we design and nurture change too. And we can start thinking about the implementation of these areas. So for example, we're looking at advancing race equality or kind of embedding intersectionality into your kind of gender equality plans, for example, asking these particular questions, is it appropriate? Is the action right? Is this acceptable to the community, or is it acceptable to the people that are closest to it? How are we engaging others that are not feeling, maybe feeling excluded by diversity and inclusion work, which does happen as well in some ways. Is this feasible? We know universities are under huge amounts of constraint in terms of resource, financial constraints, for example. So is this actually feasible to do? Because I think that's really important to keep motivation up. The cost of it, not just the financial cost of it, but also the labor cost, who's the burden being placed on, and what's the cost of not doing this particular action as well? What's the cost of not designing something that is inclusive of Black women in particular contexts, for example? Can we say that we've designed these action plans or these kind of interventions with that particular group? And are they sustainable, and can they become normalized? So at what point can we say these particular kind of actions and interventions become part of the general day-to-day practice, where we're regularly just collecting, monitoring data on our pipelines, those qualities and experiences on a regular basis as well? And some interventions that we see quite often across universities kind of focused around like training, coaching, report and support systems, curriculum reviews as being a key one, and also new strategies, new and improving strategies on diversity and inclusion more broadly. So this is just kind of looking at 3 particular interventions, just trying to get an understanding of the intersectionality considerations as well. So training is probably one of the biggest areas for diversity and inclusion work, and also for anti-racism work more broadly. But simple things, does the training even talk about intersectionality? If you're doing that big staff training rollout, for example, have you even covered that kind of concept in some ways? And a lot of training doesn't, which is quite interesting. Is the training generic, or is it kind of actually bespoke to your context? And, to think about, again, that intersectional consideration of, is the training just some generic kind of raising awareness, or is this actually going to be useful for the work that you're doing as well? Because we're looking at that kind of localized approach to diversity inclusion and intersectional approaches. If we think about coaching, for example, as another one which has come up quite a lot, and also that we can also kind of talk about reverse mentoring, think about the ways in which different groups are positioned in some ways, who is doing the mentoring or the coaching, and who is the mentee and the coachee in some ways. What's the power dynamic? Is it transactional? Is it transformative? we can start to think about the ways in which that there's considerations again in these particular intervention types. And I think report and support is one of the biggest, most contentious areas, I think, and it has been for quite some time in universities, for example. But how many report and support systems have been designed with the community? And this goes back to that point around participation. Who has been involved with the full design of a report and support system from beginning to end, and that continuous improvement as well? Can reporting be multi-agency? Can it address multiple disadvantages and needs? And where's that accountability piece as well? How do we kind of practice that in a safe and compassionate way too? So these are just some kind of like interventions you might have kind of come across or heard of, and it's just kind of layering on that intersectionality lens to kind of go a bit further with it. And I think just in terms of the context, what we're interested in is not just what works in kind of intersectionality and that kind of way of thinking. It's really thinking about what is working for who, and what circumstances, how and why. And that contextualization is really, really critical. We can generate 100 diversity inclusion action plans. I think actually recently I saw an action plan, an equality diversity action plan, which is about 40 pages long. And my first question was, can you even deliver this in the next 3 years? Because some of the actions ranged everything from a whole new data system through to this huge behavioral and cultural change projects. And it was great to see that ambition, but there was a part of this thinking, well, you're saying all the right things, but can you actually make this work? Can it actually demonstrate the impact that you want it to have? Or can you take 10 pages of this action plan, deliver them exceptionally, and then move on to the next stage, or see where the next phase of this goes? And I think this is really key. It's not just about what's working, but it's really kind of digging further. So part of intersectionality is always going that little bit further with this work. Narrative is a really, really key way in which we can contextualize this and understand this question a little bit more. And this again is encouraging us an example of trying to go beyond the pipeline and thinking about the qualities of experience, looking at voice and positioning as well. So journey maps have been used variously in the tech industry, particularly on user experience, for example, as kind of a neat way of looking at the trajectory of a person or community of people in a particular system. They can be particularly useful for just identifying the way, what happens between, when a student joins a department or school through their experience and what happens to the end. So you're not just looking at the data points of attainment or awarding grades, you're looking a little bit further beyond. And these educational journey maps can be quite useful. I'll show an example in a moment as well. Journeys in intersectionality are intrinsic to one another. Stories are an essential part of intersectionality, because without stories, we're not understanding our structures, our representation, and those policy, those wider impacts as well. And I think those journeys and stories are really, really important for us to, again, get to the heart of the issues, to tackle the complexity of doing this inclusion work as well. And it's also thinking about the ways in which stories can generate actions and also create buy-in and investment from different senior leaders and different groups as well. Stories are really kind of important part of socializing an action plan and an interventional program as well. And then typically we can see kind of like stories, usually, or journeys, having kind of two kind of key areas. So the turning points where something magnificent changes for an individual community, and those pain points, which are the barriers. And barriers came up in the previous word cloud, and stories are a way of identifying what are those enablers and barriers in some ways. So I'm just going to share a very brief journey map of a particular student journey based on evidence that was been collected and it's kind of compiled from 3 students' journeys in higher education. Just a disclaimer, that there may be some parts that might be quite triggering in the story for some people. Everyone has different interpretation of these different events. So if you do feel you need to kind of take a step back at any point, then do feel free to do that. So this is a very brief journey of Marcus, who's a black male student who's joined university through an access to higher education course, is studying engineering. And this is a very short journey of his time during his university experience. So he's got a record of school exclusions, joined as an undergraduate in engineering, made friends in his shared accommodation. During the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020, he was put on the spot during teaching and learning and invited to speak on a BLM movement at various university events and panels. He was juggling this pressure with the requirements of his degree course, so he was doing this outside of his studies, so he was juggling quite a bit, but he was still successful in keeping his grades up in his coursework, so he still continued on from year 1 to year 2. So there's some kind of, there's some emerging turning and pain points we can start to see. He recognised that in his curriculum, that in his assignments, there was no mention of any Black literature or Black authors and ideas. And during an online class, because this was during the pandemic, where things were transitioning to online learning, a white lecturer made a flippant comment about BLM and said there's no colour in engineering, which Marcus felt was concerning. And then he raised this to the tutor. He said, I'm sure he didn't mean it in this way. So we can start to see there's some some kind of remarks which are kind of dismissing Marcus's kind of concerns and comments here as well, and experience. And we might describe these as sort of micro inequalities as well. So, and then Marcus progresses towards his final year. So he's still continuing with his degree. So there's this continuation. And he's looking forward to his final project, has concerns about the supervisor. Marcus feels that the supervisor is less interested in his project and is concerned about his final degree classification. Now, this is a very kind of reduced version of the original stories that kind of this is compiled from. But as you can see, the journey itself just gives a very kind of flow of some of the key areas of the key events in Marcus's journey, even before he arrived at university, through to his final award. And I think this is really interesting. So if we apply that lens of turning and pain points in just a moment, you should start to see that actually the barriers that Marcus is facing can be mapped on to this journey in some way, shape, or form. One of the key things I said at the beginning of intersectionality is that we're not just looking at Marcus through his protected characteristics or identities. We're looking at the composition of Marcus in the context of the university system that he's experiencing. And we can see that his experience is shaped by this particular engineering department. So these green arrows are sort of the turning points where he's made successes. He's gone to university, he's continuing on, he's progressing to his final year. These are good things that we want to build on as part of the university experience. But there's multiple barriers. So whilst he's still doing and achieving these things, he's experiencing more barriers that are marginalizing his experience in the particular department, in the particular course. And these are where we might start thinking about those actions and interventions to alleviate those barriers. What might we do in terms of creating safety for inviting students onto panels, for example? How might we address the comments raised by the tutor or dealing with complaints in an inclusive and fair way as well? And how do we kind of maybe skill up supervisors to be more, to manage their time better, or to be more cognizant of supervising students in their projects, for example? So these are some things we can start to have a conversation about in looking at this as well. And it takes us a little bit further than just looking at pipeline data on the spreadsheet as well. So very, very briefly, in terms of looking at intersectionality and sort of thinking about program development and actions, designing diversity programs typically in universities can be quite difficult in prescriptive structures. And I know university structures can be quite bureaucratic. They can be a lot of committees. There can be a lot of lack of autonomy sometimes. And I think that's something that's something we need to be mindful of those contexts as well. Thinking about ways in which our actions empower staff and students rather than exacerbate more or put more work on these underrepresented groups to do more. And I think one of the core things, we can often go straight to the problem, which I think is really important. We know that there's inequalities that exist, but we need to understand what strengths we have to keep building on those and to create those strengths to be more inclusive as well. And also having that kind of understanding of not just accessibility, accommodation and adjustment from different models of inequality, but think about what can we do as a system, what can we do in our context that enables staff and students to thrive in these particular spaces as well. So just coming back to that intersectionality role, coming back to this kind of action design process, if you're putting, for example, your Athena Swan actions against this intersectionality wheel, can we say, is there anything missing from those actions that we need to be mindful of the direct or indirect impact it might have on these particular characteristics, how it might address some of these wider inequalities, and how is it informed or responding to the wider forces, particularly at a social political time when things are changing rapidly as well. So how can these actions be respondent to those or be more agile in some ways as well? So we can start to think about how we place some of our kind of ideas into this particular space as well. And again, just kind of one of the key things, and I think it's really useful thinking about intersectionality and ways to embed it into your practice and into your own kind of work, is really using questions and those kind of nudging questions to just go that a little bit further. And these are just some example questions which this session's recorded, and I'm sure can send the slides around as well. You can use these just to kind of inform your own work and approach to the work as well. And it goes back to those intersectionality principles. It reflects those difficult conversations about structure, politics, and representation. It kind of also helps us think about the ways in which we're involving communities and empowering communities, rather than keeping things transactional, but going from transactional to transformative. And I think that's something that's quite an interesting conversation to have as well. So just very briefly, and hopefully we can have some time for some discussion, reflections, and questions as well. But really want to recognize that intersectionality is not just a theory or metaphor or word. It's about action. It's premised. It was introduced to facilitate and accelerate action and diversity and inclusion more broadly. It was used to, based on the premise again of Black female scholarship and the experience of Black women, to center their voices in systems where they were never heard. And we have to think about the ways in which we're including or involving people that have not been heard or been silenced to design and create some good disruption in this space as well. Thinking about the narratives of individuals and communities in the system. We've talked a little bit about narrative, but how do we then counter narratives like Marcus's experience? What can we do to make sure that the only things that people like Marcus are having are positive and strength building exercise events, and their barriers are minimal, and minimizing those barriers. And also I think one of the nice things about intersectionality is it opens yourself up to innovation and design thinking. Reverse mentoring, for example, is very popular at the moment across universities. Can we go further? Can we go with something else? Are there other things we could be doing? I was speaking with an institution, for example, that was looking at artificial intelligence to map their routes or their journeys to kind of increase diversity and inclusion. I'm not saying we all need to invest in AI and machine learning, but it's just kind of getting that, being exploratory, taking those risks to be bold and brave for this space as well. So I kind of leave with those three take homes there. And of course, there's a range of questions and kind of intersectional thinking in my edited collection from this year as well. So feel free to, I'm just going to signpost to that as well for your own benefit. But the whole book is premised on intersectionality and using that to inform approaches in higher education as well, and very focused on action guides as well. So I'll leave that there with you and just say thanks very much for listening to me for the last 40 odd minutes.